Wait, no.
All right, welcome everybody. We'll give people just a moment to come in. Hope you're all having a lovely Tuesday. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Megan Stokel. I'm the marketing director here at FounderMade. And as a marketer myself, I'm super excited to kick off our Build Your Business Power Hour series with Braze. We're going to be doing a deep dive into all the ways you can build a winning email campaign. And in just a second, I will introduce our amazing speakers. But before I do, I just wanted to give a quick reminder to be sure to really take advantage of this session by using the Q&A in the chat to have all your burning questions answered. We'll save some time at the end to get to all of those questions to make sure you're really able to learn a lot today. And with that, I'd love to introduce Andrew Barrett, the Director of Email Deliverability at Braze.
Hi, everybody. This is Andrew. Thanks so much for having us on today. I'm really looking forward to today's session. So as Megan mentioned, I'm the Director of Deliverability here at Braze. Braze is a leading comprehensive customer engagement platform that powers interactions between consumers and the brands that they love. With Braze, global brands can ingest and process customer data in near real time and orchestrate and optimize contextually relevant cross-channel marketing campaigns and continuously evolve their customer engagement strategies. And I'm very thrilled today to have as our guest, Ms. Allison Bryant. Allison.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm very psyched to be here. As Andrew said, my name is Allison. I have a background in nonprofit fundraising as an email and social media marketer, first at the Connecticut Audubon Society and then at Brown University. And now I am a lifecycle marketer at 10% Happier, which is a meditation startup based in Boston. And I'm going to share an example of a campaign that we worked on today for email re-engagement. But before I say that, I dig into that, I'll give you a sense of who 10% Happier is. So like I said, we're a meditation app. Our co-founder, Dan Harris, who you may know from his work as an anchor on Good Morning America and Nightline on ABC News, semi-famously had a couple of panic attacks on live TV many years ago. So if I start, breathing fast or looking, too wrecked, it might run in the company.
I used the app before we started today, so I feel like I'm in good shape.
Did you do the one about a presentation? Because I also did that. And so Dan's therapist actually way back when suggested that he meditate. So he went on this sort of like journey of discovery to understand the science of meditation, and he teamed up with our other co-founders to make the 10% Happier app, which is specifically for fidgety skeptics who want to learn to meditate. I fall into that category like I do. And we now have a meditation app, we have a podcast, a few different books, and one of the things that I do in my role is figure out how to best deliver engaging content about meditation to folks when they are ready to hear it. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick and give a little bit of a demonstration of an email re-engagement campaign that we ran last April. And then Andrew and I are gonna go through and give you some pro tips on how you can run email re-engagement campaigns. Let me just and here we are. All right. So this was last March and April. 10% Happier as a company. We were in a bit of a dry spell in between some of our big meditation challenges that are really engaging for folks. And they basically a way to check in and learn to meditate for 21 days. But we had, like I said, a bit of a dry spell. So we thought, okay, is there a way that we can create basically a messaging campaign that uses and reuses content that we can really put in front of people to re-engage users in this time where we don't have a ton else going on in the product. And the thing that we really wanted to learn was to say, okay, can we use messaging, cross-channel messaging that we sent through Braze to re-engage users rather than building something out in the product in the app that takes a lot of time and a lot of engineering resources and investment. Is this something that we can do more efficiently just via messaging? So the campaign consisted of a series of content, and for us, that's podcasts and newsletters, meditations, meditation talks that we promoted pretty aggressively using email, push, and in-app messaging, and also, having it out on our podcast. And the theme that we decided to work around is the concept of hope as a skill. So basically what we're trying to see here, it's inspired by the Buddhist concept of wise hope, which is basically, folks can think about hope as, okay, I really hope I get that promotion. I'm really wishing for something out there in the world, and I'm pinning all my emotions on it. And if it doesn't come true, well, I'm just going to be devastated. I'm going to be disappointed. But the Buddhist concept of wise hope is a little bit different. It's saying, okay, I can't control the outcome. There are things I can do to try to make things work for myself, but at the end of the day, there are some things I can't control. Can I feel hopeful about my, trusting in my ability to sort of roll with the punches and get things out of whatever life ends up giving to me? And we chose to do this pretty specifically in the context of COVID. If you cast your mind back to April in the US, we were just sort of getting vaccine access rolled out to a larger, more sort of like general population. People were really excited about, oh my God, this is going to change everything. Are we going to get to go back to something more like what life was like a couple of years ago? What's this evolution like? But also, we had all been disappointed many times. If you remember in March 2020, when we all thought, oh, we'll be home for 2 weeks. How silly will that be? And then just cascading disappointments following us as time went on. And so we thought, okay, we want to re-engage folks. We like this idea of wise hope. It feels really timely. It feels pretty specific. And it can be part of folks. It can really be a good reason to come back to folks who haven't engaged with us in a while, because we have something really specific and relevant and timely for them. So I wanted to show you some examples of some of the content and the messages that we put in front of our users. So these two app screens on the left side are some of the content from the app. You can see we called this hope as a skill, again, trying to communicate to folks, this is something, hope isn't something that just happens to you. This is something that you can cultivate and something that you can practice. And so you can see here some, meditations about finding hope in the everyday, or boosting your experience of gratitude. This other screen, it's full of some talks about, things like hope and equanimity, defining what wise hope means in a Buddhist context. And then on the right side of the slide, you can see a couple of the messages that we sent to our users. You can see, there's the whole context of, hey, vaccines are entering arms, but there's a lot of uncertainty. How can we hope without just immediately being disappointed? And up at the top, you can see this little push notification, hoping to pique our users' interests in this topic. And we ran a pretty aggressive campaign for these messages. This was over a period of 2 weeks. I think we sent email messages to folks who were regular, I would say to folks who were, both folks who were regularly engaging with us and a large audience of folks who had engaged with us less, who we were trying to get back in front of and re-engage. And we sent, I think, emails for 6 of the 7 days of the week. And we sent push notifications, I think twice that week. So it was a pretty aggressive campaign to try to really get in front of people and say, hey, we have something for you for right now. And it ended up working out really quite well for us. The stat that I found the most useful in deciding whether or not I wanted to do this again was looking and seeing that we got about a 30% increase in resurrection rate for folks who received this campaign from us. And what that means is these are folks who, for I think it's 90 days prior, hadn't logged in to the app, hadn't started a meditation, had been like pretty much inactive. And what we saw was that people who received this campaign, by 30%, were coming back and becoming re-engaged. Also, a couple of things happened that I kind of didn't expect, but which were really positive for us. We pitched this campaign that we ran to the Apple App Store, and they featured us, which was great for registrations. Our PR agency used this series to pitch a placement for our co-founder on Vanity Fair's podcast. And we also got, really awesome positive feedback from our users. I did a survey afterwards. I asked a lot of different questions, but the piece that I thought was maybe interesting to share with y'all was this question about how people heard about the Hope is a Skill series. So most folks, 60% of these folks who responded to the survey, obviously, a more engaged audience already if they're responding to a survey, but only 60% of them said, "Oh yeah, I got a message about the Hope is a Skill series," and that's how I heard of this. And that to me said that, like, even with a heavier cadence, people were not feeling as overwhelmed as I perhaps had been worried about. Certainly, you need to take that with a grain of salt. But I think that to me said, okay, there's an opportunity for growth for us where we can be messaging more often as long as we are also messaging strategically and we have something really useful and relevant to say. The last thing that I'll just show you here, these are a couple of quotes from users who meditated with us or who read our newsletters, listened to our podcasts. This one on the left, I just think is like very soul affirming. Someone talking about, I have issues with hope. A lifetime taught me it was dangerous and not to be trusted. I'm baby stepping my way to new possibilities with hope. I'm glad the meditations are there for me when I'm ready, which I really loved as a way to sort of pull out, hey, we think that we're going to see the impact of a campaign like this right away. And we do see immediate impact, but there's also a tail. There's an engagement tail that's going to extend through to the future. And then the other piece here that I thought was useful is that this person sort of pulled out, thanks for continually developing new content that speaks to the changing needs of the times. I appreciate knowing 10% is committed to providing support for whatever new challenges arise. Which I was like, oh, you speak in my language. I'm so excited that we are occupying a space in our users' minds of this particular source of wisdom is going to be there for me in the moment that I am experiencing these kind of problems. And I want to, getting this kind of feedback is, okay, I want to hear from you more. And that's exactly what you want to happen at the end of a re-engagement campaign. So those were the particular pieces of the slides that I wanted to show y'all. We are going to be answering questions at the end of our little fireside Q&A session. But now I'm going to hand it over to Andrew to talk about some pro tips for how you can run an engagement campaign, what you should be thinking about, especially from a deliverability perspective.
Thanks so much, Allison. That is such an amazing case study and so timely. I think the kinds of content and the kind of messaging is very appealing to a huge, broad audience who really need a little help, I think, in terms of hope in their personal lives. But if we step back for a moment and separate what we're doing professionally as marketers, the bad news is hope is definitely not a useful skill for email deliverability. If we send messages to every email address we've ever come across in our marketing campaigns without regard to engagement value, there is not a lot of hope for deliverability and outcomes. So what we want to talk about today and focus on specifically as part of the case study is the efforts to re-engage with those users who may have lapsed for some period. They haven't opened an email message in a long time. They might not have fired up the app in a little while. All of us at one time or another, I'm certain, struggle at one time or another with this competing tension between trying to grow your audiences, including email audiences, as aggressively as you possibly can, because that's what we're here to do. But there's this also conflicting requirement to maintain your deliverability with those folks who are most likely and that you already know are going to engage with the messaging that you're sending. The problem is that recipient engagement is the one key factor in email deliverability. So the more volume of messaging we're sending to unengaged subscribers alongside volumes that we're sending to our folks who want to hear from us all the time, the more risk we present to failing to engage with any of these folks. So, not a week goes by that I don't work with a sender who's struggling with that exact conflict. And it's heartbreaking in a way because a lot of these teams understand what the right thing is to do in these cases, but they're often stymied by those, those growth and revenue requirements being handed down to them. So for those of you who are caught in that struggle right now, believe me, you are seen. And for whatever that's worth, take it away. So the question then is, how can we approach and resolve this tension between those two conflicting requirements in a data-driven way for re-engaging with those lapsed subscribers? So pro tip number one, how do we de-risk engagement campaigns with segmentation? So the usual approach to this is to create segments of your recipient file according to the time from their most recent engagement just via email. You may have other metrics available to you to consider for segmentation of audiences by engagement. But bear in mind that the ISPs, the folks that provide these free inboxes for your recipients, can't see any of that other data. So what they are very specifically interested in is, what's your history of sending email to folks who appear to expect and want the mail that you're sending? So if we create these segments of your recipient file, you're very strong engagers who open everything you send ever. A medium segment that might open email messages once a month if you're sending on a weekly cadence. A third and a fourth, and then that big old huge bolus, that chunk of historically disengaged recipients. So the strategy here is, once we have that set of segments created and defined for ourselves, we can then very finely tune the volumes and the proportion of engagers to disengaged recipients, so that we are always sending, first and foremost, the messages that people want and expect. But alongside with that, we're going to send a small sliver of volume, a fraction of recipients who that we're trying to re-engage with. The idea here is to provide some reputational covering fire for those folks who may not have engaged with an email in the very recent past. And the further and further back you reach into that long-term disengaged segment, the more you need, the more covering fire you need from those folks who are likely to engage. And, one of three things can happen as a result of that effort. Option number one, our preferred option, is that those lapsed users engage with your messaging once again, and we can graduate or promote them into a segment of much more recently engaged users, and they can be used to provide some additional covering fire. Number two, getting good inbox, but they're not really engaging with the messaging in any meaningful way that the ISPs can actually measure and give you credit for. And that's a whole other conversation. That, not so great, because it really doesn't resolve the tension. It doesn't give you a dispositive result on those individual recipients. The third option is that you're reaching the inbox, they open the message and decide that they're not really interested in what you have to say and they unsubscribe. You know what? That is a perfectly awesome outcome. That is free money. I will take those unsubscribes every time because there is no clearer signal of recipient disengagement aside from a spam complaint, right? But that unsubscribe doesn't have the reputational punishment associated with it that a spam complaint does. So if you gather those unsubscribes, great. We'll never bother you again. We've made more room in our reputation, in our volumes, to send messages to folks for whom we don't have an answer yet. So these are all strategies we can use to try and win back some of those lapsed users, but be prepared. Have a plan for those folks who are persistent in remaining unengaged. If after some period of time they still fail to engage with the messaging, you have to leave them alone. Otherwise, they're going to hold hostage your deliverability to folks that most want to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And Andrew, I had a question for you, actually about, so one of the things that I really have enjoyed about using Braze is that it's, a mobile first service. And so I was able to also, at the same time that I'm sending, a higher than usual volume of email, I can choose for some of these folks to not send email and instead to send push messages or, in-app messages, which, hopefully someone's seeing an in-app message, they're at least somewhat engaged, they have opened your app. Are there any do you have any thoughts on the strategy of using these different channels as it relates to deliverability or things that we should be thinking about for those other?
Yeah, there's no one hard and fast rule for every vertical anywhere. It really, really needs to be tested for each individual sender. They may want to hear from you, but email may not be their preferred channel from which they can hear from you. Lots of people spend their lives in their email inbox. Lots of people would prefer to spend a lot less time in their email inbox. And for those folks, push notifications or in-app messages may be the way to go. And this kind of leads me into pro tip, number 2, which is, choose the right channel for the right message and for the right recipient. And you hit the nail on the head earlier, Allison. Braze has the advantage or an advantage in the marketplace that you have all of these channel options at your disposal. We're not just a pure email play. Email is one of many. And for recipients who want to hear from you via email, then maybe we should send them some email. But for those who don't, find out what they want and find out how they want to hear it from you before you send it to them. And which always raises the question, well, how do I figure out what they want? And the answer is, stunningly enough, ask them. One of the best ways you can get important information about what your recipients want to hear from you and how is to just flat out ask them. And a lot of senders, I think, make the mistake of pouring a whole bunch of time and resources in developing a really transparent and flexible preference center. So that's good. But then they make the mistake of not exposing that preference center to the subscriber until after they're already headed for the exits. And by then, it's just too late to salvage what could have been a valuable permission-based relationship. So I think that the best senders are putting a short set of options around content and around cadence in front of the recipients at the beginning of that email relationship. And what you've done now is you've set a very clear expectation with your intended recipient about what kind of content they're going to get from you and how often. You have given them an opportunity to choose their own adventure, so to speak. And so if you're able to set that expectation and then meet it, which is often a wholly different challenge, but those senders who can set a clear expectation and then meet that expectation are the same senders who enjoy the most success around deliverability. Anytime we surprise a recipient, either with our presence in their inbox or with content that they weren't expecting from you, that is never a good thing for email deliverability.
I'm curious if, you'd mentioned this is something that that senders should be doing at the beginning of your relationship. Have you seen anyone, perhaps they're making a switch and they're like, yeah, we want to have permissions-based marketing now. We are starting to do this at the beginning of the relationship, but we have folks with whom we have an existing relationship, and we want to, kind of go back to them and surface this. Have you seen any examples of that being done well or successfully?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what you, in a way, it speaks to the difference between using email as an acquisition tool and email as a retention tool. And as it turns out, email is just absolute crap for acquiring new customers, because you got to send somebody messaging that they don't expect to acquire them via email. That probably not the best use of your time and resources. But if you have an existing relationship with a customer because they've downloaded the app, because they've made a purchase, maybe they've given you informed consent in the course of that purchase to send you email, that is a retention opportunity. And that's where email really shines. And so that's where you might want to turn to other channels to cover that acquisition piece. So if, for example, you have an app and you're using a platform like Braze, you can push them in-app notifications that say, hey, we've got this really awesome email newsletter that you may be interested based on how you are using the app, right? Again, real-time data flowing through the platform will give you a very clear sense of what types of content recipients and users are already interested in before you send them this proposition. Longer form email, more content than what you can get in a simple push message or in-app notification. Would you like it? Check here, right? You can acquire email recipients in the app, which is not something that a lot of platforms are able to do, and represents a significant strategic advantage for Braze among a pretty crowded marketplace. I mean, not to be overly salesy here, but I spent the last 22 years before coming to Braze working at pure email plays. And I ran the global deliverability practice at Salesforce and at Adobe Campaign. None of them at that time had anything that even comes close. And if you're ready to use it with strategic precision, it's an incredibly useful way to tune up your email practice while using channels outside of email. Yeah. So we had been speaking before about setting an expectation during onboarding, and so how do we translate that concept, going back to the original use case, with setting expectations for folks who originally signed up but have since lapsed? Well, if we are going to those lapsed users with the same kinds of content that we already know they hate, why would we keep sending them that same stuff? I think it was Einstein who said that's the definition of insanity. So in these re-engagement campaigns, as we're dialing in our proportions of engaged versus unengaged segments, we'll need to take the further step of creating something special, something unique and different that's more likely to appeal to these lapsed users than whatever it is that they're already chronically disengaged with. It seems like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised, or maybe not, how many senders fail to see the connection between their content and disengagement. I think it's an easy mistake to make. As email marketers, we breathe this stuff all day long. we pour all of this energy and all of these resources into crafting the message that's going to get through and inspire engagement with their recipients. But our recipients are not us. They're not dumb. They're just really busy, and they don't care about the same things that we care about. And so finding the things that they care about is really important. We can ask them, we can test if we don't have the kind of data that we need or don't have access to the kind of data we need to make informed guesses about what's likely to work. We always have the option of testing in small segments and then rolling out those changes to a broader audience, or perhaps testing the winner of several cohorts against the winner of a small handful of other cohorts until you arrive at a message or a series of messages that seems more likely to re-engage with those folks who just persisting in not opening any messages.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting like calibration between, Andrew, what you were talking about with, you don't want to surprise people.
Right.
You know, you don't want it to, you don't want it to come completely out of left field, but you don't want to do the same thing that isn't working.
Right.
And testing is a great way to try to get some calibration between those two things. One of the reasons that I think we felt confident in speaking to our users about, you know, honestly, like pretty explicitly about COVID, which is, you know, not always something people want to hear about in their inbox, not always something people want to hear about from a meditation company. You know, there's, but the reason we felt more confident being able to do that is that we had some different sources of data on what our audience has enjoyed. And in particular, we are lucky to also have a podcast, and we could look at podcast download and engagements for different topics when we were thinking about like, oh, what might be useful and interesting to folks. Okay, well, we have a whole bunch of different podcasts about different topics. We can look at those and try to find something that might be resonant that we haven't talked about in this other area. Or we can look at, you know, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but, you know, we have a weekly newsletter, and those weekly newsletters have different topics, and we can get a sense of like, oh, when we go, you know, we're a meditation company, when we go this far, you know, this far away from the original thing, people don't like that, and they let us know. You know, we have a survey in our newsletter that people, you know, I would say probably at least like, you know, we get a pretty good like 50 to 100 responses a week to every newsletter topic that we get out there, and we review them and we say, all right, like, did this hit?
Nice.
You know, how are we doing with this? And so it makes it so that you have somewhere to go, so that you're not guessing at like what is that balance between surprise and the same old thing.
That feedback loop is incredibly important. And you're right. COVID is an ugly topic in all kinds of ways. It's ugly personally, it's ugly politically, unfortunately. But where 10% has sort of threaded the needle is that it also speaks to everyone in a very personal way. Very different ways, to be sure, but those ways are often very personal. The best analogy I can think of is like, hey, you know, have you ever gone out on a bad date? Not that I'm an expert on dating or anything like that, but, you know, have you ever gone out with a person who just wouldn't stop talking about themselves, and you just couldn't get a word in edgewise? Did you give them a second date? You know, probably not. You probably couldn't wait to get out of the restaurant. Maybe you snuck out to the bathroom and just kept on walking, right? So email is sort of the same way. And when marketers are talking about themselves, which is often the temptation, what you're really doing is talking about what you, the marketer, needs. And recipients, your date, probably not interested in hearing that from you, or at least not for very long, right? When we talk about what the recipients need in your email, now that's a conversation. And I think that makes much a more interesting experience, certainly a much more engaging experience for recipients. And if your recipients are engaging with that message, the ISPs are measuring that engagement in certain ways, and they are awarding you better reputation as a result, which means your future messaging stands a better chance at getting quick and reliable access to the inboxes of those folks who most want to hear from you. And even maybe a few that they don't know yet whether they want to hear from you or not. And then you have that chance to engage with those folks who may have lapsed or who may not have received a message from you before. So for all of those reasons, that feedback is incredibly important.
There's I think in terms of a sender that is talking to folks about what their experience is, I highly recommend signing up for the Whole30 email list. Their co-founder, Melissa Urban, is
nice.
Like the messages that she sends, I think are actually like quite brilliant. They're long, they're detailed. She just sent one that I read that was about how to say no, how to draw boundaries in your relationships, and it's like she'll give like 10 prompts or like 10, responses that you can give to a bunch of different situations. She talked about having to say no to something because of COVID, or having to say no to, dinner with someone who you just don't enjoy dinner with. But it's, it's so personal and specific, and you wouldn't think that, she ties it back into Whole30 a bit, but I think really what's so brilliant about it is like, if you're going to do Whole30, right, you're going to have to say no when people offer you food.
Right.
And that's a barrier to using her program. And she finds all these ways to address things that are like really specific to your life, but actually also tie back to what she's all about and what her program's all about.
That's a beautiful thing. Having a conversation via email is a tricky thing to do, especially when it feels like you're the only one doing the talking. But we can hold up their end of the conversation by talking about things that are important to them. And the email marketers who enjoy the most success are the same marketers who are able to lead their recipients down a path towards a solution that the recipients are interested in, because they're not interested in conversions. They're not interested in opens and clicks. Sometimes they're not even interested in coupons. Although sometimes they are. It can be a very effective tool, but it should be used carefully and sparingly for a bunch of reasons. So I think we're coming up to the 40-minute mark on today's session. And if it's okay, I think we can throw it open to questions from other participants.
Speaking of one-way conversations.
That was incredible, guys. And we actually have some questions that have already come through. We have questions that were submitted upon registration. So one question that I really loved was, you talked about preference centers. If a recipient unsubscribes from, a certain messaging stream, is the standard to say they're not receiving anything across the board, or what is the standard practice for that?
Right. So this was actually a matter of great debate not too many years ago over at the organization, where we agree on best practices and on other related topics. So here's where it lands. When a recipient subscribes for email, that one act can often subscribe that same user to a number of campaigns, which is fine, assuming, of course, that those subscriptions are all, sent with the advanced informed consent of the recipient, as we described earlier in the session. So the rule of thumb here is that the unsubscribe event must be exactly as granular as the original subscribe. So if the one subscription caused them to be subscribed to 7 campaigns, then the unsubscribed must remove them from those same 7 campaigns and any other campaigns that they may have been added to as a result of that, the fruit of that tree, right? So no, you don't have to unsubscribe them from everything. In fact, I think a lot of recipients would be surprised that that was the outcome. One good example is you shouldn't necessarily unsubscribe them for transactional mail, purchases, parcels, passwords, that kind of messaging. You would still want to keep them subscribed, but for those other things, keeping careful track of your segmentation in a platform like Braze, which makes it incredibly easy, you can then meet the express wishes of your intended recipient with a minimum risk of deliverability to all those other folks who still want to stay subscribed.
Amazing. And sort of along those same lines, if an organization has existing lists that may have old data and, as they're working to start segmenting out their list to be able to really target communications and keep engagement rates high, what are some best tips for moving forward, cleaning up old data and, segmenting data
right
as they build as well?
Yeah, I mean, so the key piece of information here is how old is old. I mean, did somebody find a 3.5-inch floppy disk in the bottom of a drawer with 1 million email addresses on it? I mean, right. So in the late 90s, I was a director for the world's first anti-spam block list, and I know how we would go about conditioning spam traps and then pushing them out into production, and then how we gather the data and use that data to publish opinions on the quality of certain senders' sending practices, whether we thought they were spammers or not. And generally speaking, the time it takes for an email address or a particular domain, the time it takes to condition that asset is usually about 6 months. For example, we might go out and find some domains as a spam blocker, as a block list publisher. We might go out and find domains that had recently expired and then purchase them for ourselves, and then create it so that that domain is rejecting 100% of all messages sent to it for some period, right? Usually that period is about 6 months, because after that 6-month period, we turn email back on for that domain and we see who the heck is still trying to send email after nothing but rejections and radio silence for 6 whole entire months. And those were the senders who wound up getting called out on the block list. And by and large, those trap operators are still doing things about the same way. So the rule of thumb here is that after about 6 months of unengagement, the chances that any individual email address or domain has been transformed into a spam trap goes up exponentially, right? So if you're looking at list segments that you have in contact in 6 months or longer, that data is likely to be toxic, and you should probably handle it accordingly with, thick yellow rubber gloves and get rid of it. Now, I speak from a place of great convenience, I understand, because you're likely to get pushback from other leaders in the business who may be, reluctant to let those perfectly good email addresses go after just 6 months. And so what we can do then is test, and we can use a similar exercise like the re-engagement strategy we discussed earlier to test to see the likelihood that those very, very old recipients are going to wake up in sufficient number to be worth attempting to re-engage with again. But just bear in mind, the further out you go, it's like walking on a frozen pond. The ice can get very thin very quickly and can break behind you. When we start hitting spam traps, it's not an instant death knell. One spam trap hit typically doesn't result in a block list publication, but the further out you go, the more and more traps you're likely to hit. And so you can very quickly find yourself in a situation where all your mail, wanted and otherwise, is blocked. So
we do not want that.
definitely not, especially with Christmas right around the corner.
Yes. And what are your thoughts on platforms like Zero Bounds and spending money on cleaning up lists that way?
I think that there's a role for those folks, a role for those products, but I think that senders often attribute more use to it or meaning to it than they might actually rate. I would still be quite careful with those tools. Back in the day, you would very easily get a very binary yes, no directly from a vendor like that about whether an email address was still live and had a live human being behind it. But ISPs, the free inbox providers, don't like these guys. It's nothing personal. The problem is how they actually go about trying to verify an individual recipient. And typically what they'll do is open an SMTP connection. They'll actually walk up to the ISP and say, hey, Gmail, I got a big old bag of mail for you. Let's swap mail. Gmail says, okay, bring it on. And they start passing, letters one at a time. Does John at Gmail live here? And Gmail will say, nope. Okay, does Greg? And on and on and on. And so this wastes a lot of resources and computing cycles that the ISPs had originally intended for the transfer of actual mail. When they're handing the envelopes over, these validation services are saying, does John live here? Gmail says, yes, John lives here. Give me the mail. And then the validation service walks away. There is no mail. They're just looking for a yay or nay on whether John lives there or not. And that's wasteful enough, but the rules of the road on the internet, not to get too technically deep in the weeds, the rules require that recipient ISP to leave that email connection open for some period after it appears to have been abandoned by the sender, because stuff happens, right? There is definitely such a thing as intermittent outages. And so that time is there to allow the sender to gracefully resume that SMTP transaction. But of course they never will, because they were never planning to send mail in the first place. And so it becomes very wasteful. And so it's a bit of a running gunfight between the ISPs and certain of these providers who are bad actors, and they are trying to disguise themselves using different strategies, like coming at them from a wide range of IP space in, Romania or Vietnam or the Ukraine. And so the ISP is trying to block that activity as much as they can. So today, instead of getting that binary yes or no, what you get is a confidence level, like we're 80% sure that this is a real recipient. And what they're really telling you is that it's been a period of time since we were last able to successfully validate that recipient. And so the longer the amount of time passes since they were last successful in validating that recipient, the lower and lower the confidence gets in the score. So I think that they can be useful, but use them with care. I think some of the more useful providers in that space are doing a very lightweight check on the validity of that email address. They're typically checking first and foremost whether the address is syntactically correct. Does it meet the definition of a valid email address, whether or not there's a carbon-based life form using that email address. And that's useful. It also, for better or worse, over time, you get a sense of where the spam traps are and who's operating them. And so some of them get known pretty well, although that's not reliable either because they're constantly coming in and out of production all the time. And so they can check for the appearance or the frequency of appearance of known traps in that list as well. So they can be useful. The lightweight ones are more useful, checking for syntax, checking for the viability of the address at the point of collection. That is a perfectly fair use. But when you start digging deeper into these more invasive approaches, that's where things get a little bit cloudier and a little less reliable. Wow, that was a really long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
It was great. Lots of really, really useful information there.
I learned a lot.
And Cynthia in the audience submitted a couple questions, and one of them is about emailing people who've signed up or who've purchased through Stripe or PayPal, and that method marks them in the platform as signed up for email. How do you treat those? Are they like, do you treat them as if they have signed up for your newsletter? What's best practice there?
I think it's a mistake to assume that if they want the product, they want the email. It certainly introduces a degree of questionableness or around the reliability or the quality of your email address, unless you're segmenting them out separately from those who have given explicit consent to receive email in the first place. Purchases are a nice way to ensure that you actually have a valid address, because if they've actually gone through all the rigmarole of buying something from you and coughed up all of this important financial data to complete the purchase, it's very likely, or at least more likely than not, that they've also provided an accurate email address, maybe to get that receipt, et cetera. But to extend that permission for something beyond a purchase, I think, is kind of a sketchy place to go.
Is there a good way to engage them and saying, like, thanks for your purchase, do you want to learn more from us? Something, in creating an engagement campaign around that segmented list?
There is. I think we just have to be careful about how salesy we get in our transactional messaging, right? So the Federal Trade Commission back in 2003 passed the federal anti-spam law, which is actually not an anti-spam law, but there's explicit carve-outs for transactional messaging. And the question then becomes, well, how much marketing content can I put in my transactional messages? And the law isn't very clear about that at all, but fortunately, some years later, the FTC did provide some additional guidance around that. And it turns out to be, what is the primary purpose of the email? If the primary purpose, in the eyes of a reasonable person, is to confirm the transaction, then that's fine to put a little bit of marketing messaging alongside that transactional verbiage, but not to the point where it exceeds the apparent primary purpose of the message. So maybe you can, surface your preference center there, or give them the option in that confirmation message to enroll in newsletters.
That is great advice.
Well, be careful now, because I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, but I don't think anybody will come after you for doing a little bit of testing around that.
Yeah, so I feel like it's always very tricky because I, as everybody else in the world, does a lot of online shopping, and I feel like sometimes I check my personal inbox and it's all, messages from brands that I've purchased from before. And, I don't remember signing up for a newsletter, but it's kind of just like I get all of these, and I understand that that's where it's coming from. It's
Right.
from my past purchases. But I could also see how, when you don't sign up, likelihood of engagement is a lot lower.
I love
And then
that.
there's all the legal stuff as well. So
Well, I mean, the good news is that the anti-spam law reserves enforcement for the FTC. So individual recipients have no claim, they have no standing, they can't sue you. But if the FTC thinks you're being a bad actor, they can bring enforcement action. But they usually reserve that for the worst of the worst. I mean, the folks who are, criminal enterprises who have no intention of abiding by best practices or even forming a long-lasting relationship with a customer. So there's typically not much of a concern around that.
yikes. All right, so we only have about 4 minutes left, but there was a couple of questions that came in upon registration about content. And I'd love to hear from both of you guys what your top tips are. So first quick question is, what is your best advice for catchy subject lines?
Test. Test. It's always surprising how much difference one little word can make in the outcomes or the placement of a comma. It's crazy. And it's just because people are people. Here's an example. I once worked with a lender who wanted to send messaging around new rates on refinance mortgages. Mortgages. Turns out that recipients don't care about mortgages, but they would really like to hear about home loans. Right? What's the difference? I don't know what the difference is, but apparently there's a big difference because the testing tells me so. Things like that make a big difference. So test it as much as you can and roll out what works to a preponderance of your recipients. The best subject lines, again, are the ones that speak directly to a recipient and their concerns and their needs. And the best subject line I have ever seen, ever, was very simple. It said, "You're not alone." That was it. I had no idea what they might have been talking about. And that curiosity and that empathy combined was apparently a very powerful driver of engagement with the messaging that appeared under that subject line. So you never know.
Yeah. And I will say a great way to figure out things like home loans versus mortgages, or, the sort of deep questions that are keeping people up at night, is to, as often as you can, even if it's not in your marketing team, even if it's a product thing or it's part of support, like read what your customers write about you and about their lives. Like being able to sit in on, support conversations or product conversations. People will tell you how they think about, how you and they interact. They'll use different words than you would think. And often you'll try to I find myself, I will try to okay, well, I've got, this story from a user and this one and this one and this one. How do I go one level up to synthesize this and make it, applicable to all those things? And that's helpful when I'm trying to think about what we should be offering them, but it's not helpful when I'm trying to tell them what they're going to get out of opening this email. You want to use their words just as absolutely as much as you can.
Love that. That is wonderful. And we are just about at time. That flew by. Thank you guys so much for your amazing expertise and all the tips you shared. For our audience, stay in touch with Andrew and Allison. I've included their websites and their social handles here. We'll be sharing the recording of this session and links to their sites and ways to get in touch tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. Any last minute, anything that you guys want to add?
What I would say is you definitely figuring out where to start with re-engagement can feel very overwhelming. Starting with a really small list and like testing out different things, especially if you're like cycling through your content and you don't want to end up with those deliverability hits that Andrew was talking about, like it can actually be, you know, in terms of your business, there's a list of people who at one point were with you. And I think if you can be respectful of their decisions and find out if, you know, hey, do we still have something that you might need? Like that's a really worthwhile question to ask. That's what I would say.
Love that. Andrew, any last thoughts?
What's for lunch?
All right, lunch break, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We have our Build Your Business Power Hour series this week and next, Discovery Show at Home on November 18th, and then our final virtual summit of the year focused on D2C innovators on December 9th. So hope to see you all there. Thank you, everybody, and see you soon.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.